I'm gonna raise her alone, I tell Keith firmly. But Keith just laughs carelessly.
Go ahead. Do whatever you want.
Sarah isn't an object. Yet, all I feel towards Keith's nonchalant attitude is disgust. There's no point in talking to Keith any longer.
Well then, I gotta go to be with my beloved Barbara. You two, get along nicely. Even if you both collapse, I'm no longer part of it. Don't you dare come crawling back to me.
With that, Keith left the house. Later,
Is Sarah here?
Keith returned in a frenzy. He must have found out Sarah's secret anyway. What nerve do you have showing up now? I gazed at Keith with a contemptuous look.
Shut up. You keeping quiet is cowardly too. Sarah, let's live with your real family. Dad, were you bullied by your stepmom?
Keith looked at Sarah, calling out to her repeatedly. The next moment, Sarah looked at Keith with a disdainful look and says,
Who are you?
I'm Michelle Morgan. I'm 45 years old this year. I'm currently living with my husband, Keith, who are the same age as me, and our daughter, Sarah. Keith was a classmate of mine back in middle school. Back then, Keith was a troublemaker while I was quiet, so we hardly had any interaction at all. Keith often skipped classes and just slept in the classroom. I think he was quite a problematic child. However, Keith had some good qualities too. One of them was how he valued friendships. Keith got along with everyone, regardless of gender. He seemed to cherish his friends, and he was always ready to listen to the problems of his friends in need. I observed Keith from afar, and we never became particularly close, graduating from middle school as we were. Keith and I ended up going to different high schools. We reunited as adults. One day, there was going to be a middle school reunion. I'm already in my 40s. I was very curious about what everyone had become as adults. We might be able to reminisce about the good old days. Feeling a desire to see my old classmates and friends after a long time, I decided to attend the reunion. And there, by chance, sitting next to me was Keith.
Could it be Michelle? Long time no see.
Keith casually struck up a conversation with me. I used to have a plain appearance back then, so I didn't stand out much. So I was surprised that Keith remembered me. However, strangely, I didn't feel bad about it. Keith, you've changed. I'm surprised. Keith used to dress like a delinquent back in middle school. But now, Keith has short hair and wears refreshing clothes. There's hardly any trace of his old self. After that, Keith and I hit it off, and we exchanged contact information when it was time to wrap up. Afterwards, we started meeting regularly. And eventually, we started dating and began to think about marriage. It seemed Keith was the same way, and one day he proposed to me.
Do you want to marry me?
Since I couldn't imagine marrying anyone other than Keith, I accepted his proposal. The moment Keith was delighted, I couldn't help but smile with joy too. We're both getting up there in age, so we decided to just register our marriage. We decided not to have a wedding ceremony or a honeymoon. After registering our marriage, Keith informed me that he was actually divorced and had a daughter. I was surprised, but it was already after we got married. It was too late to reconsider marriage, and at this age, it's difficult to have my own children. I decided to think positively that I could finally raise a child. Luckily, Sarah, who became my new daughter, is a very good kid. I'm sure the three of us can get along well. I believed that. However, that belief was quickly shattered. After getting married, Keith reverted back to his mischievous behavior from middle school. Maybe he was just good at hiding it when we were dating. Soon after we got married, Keith and Sarah moved into the house where I lived. I had bought a house out of concern for my retirement. At that time, Keith and Sarah were living in an apartment. It would be cheaper for Keith and Sarah to move into my house rather than keeping the apartment. So I asked Keith and Sarah to cancel the lease on the apartment and move in with me. Fortunately, there were several spare rooms. When I told Keith about the rent savings, he happily agreed to the move. And so when Keith and Sarah moved in, we had peaceful days for a while. Keith works as a carpenter, and he often comes home late at night. Since I have the flexibility to work from home, I ended up taking care of Sarah most of the time. I'm also responsible for taking Sarah to and from daycare. At first, Keith was grateful to me for that.
Sorry for always being so busy. Let's go out for a meal on Sundays as an apology. I'll treat you.
Whenever Keith had to work overtime, he would say that to me. But after living together for a while, even that consideration changed in just half a year.
I'm going out drinking with my coworkers tonight. Don't need dinner.
Keith would send me such a message, then wouldn't come back until the next morning. We're still newlyweds. I think that's just plain rude. So in the morning, I tried to confront Keith. But as soon as Keith came home, he locked himself in the room, and we couldn't have a discussion.
Sorry, but I'm hungover. Leave me alone. I'm taking the day off from work today.
That's what Keith always says when things get inconvenient for him. He always emphasizes his bad physical condition, so I can't assert myself strongly. I understand. That was all I could reply. And my worries weren't just about Keith. I was also concerned about Sarah. Because Sarah is physically weak and frequently gets a fever. She coughs a lot, and her health is often not good. And I often receive requests to pick her up from daycare while I'm at work. Since I have no experience raising children, I have nothing to compare it to. But I was worried that this might be too much. Feeling concerned, I consulted Keith about Sarah one morning before he left for work. It's about Sarah. She's had a fever 5 times already this month. Isn't that too much? It's clear that she's been having a high fever frequently. Then Keith frowned and said,
Even if you suddenly say that, isn't it inevitable to some extent if she's living in a daycare environment?
That being said, I raised a puzzled voice, and Keith came up with an idea.
I think Sarah is just not used to the sudden change in environment. Since you've become a mother now, Michelle, you should feed Sarah more nutritious food and take better care of her.
I was dumbfounded by Keith's argument. It's as if he's saying that I'm not feeding Sarah properly. Unable to say anything, Keith then uttered even more carefree words.
Anyway, I'm busy. So Michelle, please take care of it.
And then Keith went off to work. Keith is Sarah's real father. Isn't Keith worried about Sarah? That thought briefly crossed my mind, but right now, I'm worried about Sarah. I bought a cookbook and tried to make meals with high nutritional value as much as possible. But all my efforts seemed futile, and one day an unexpected event occurred. That evening, while I was cooking dinner in the kitchen, I felt uneasy because I couldn't hear Sarah's voice in the living room where she was supposed to be. She would usually be watching TV and singing happily. Sarah, what's wrong? I went to the living room to check on Sarah's condition and froze. Because Sarah had collapsed. Her expression was filled with pain. Sarah, are you okay? I hurriedly called out to Sarah. But there was no response at all. So I immediately called for an ambulance. And at the hospital, I learned an unexpected truth. Pediatric cancer.
Yes, I'd like to discuss the treatment plan going forward.
The doctor calmly explained the current situation. I felt like I was starting to panic, but thanks to the doctor's composed demeanor, I managed to calm down somewhat. It was decided that we would conduct more detailed tests tomorrow to determine the course of action. Since today is Sunday, it seems that the specialist won't be available.
Mom? Can we go home today?
She regained consciousness, but Sarah looked uneasy upon waking up in the hospital. Yes, it's okay. Let's go home together. I answered Sarah with a smile. Today is Sunday, but Keith wasn't at home. That's because Keith is out drinking with friends again today. He was happily searching for a restaurant on his phone yesterday. Keith left the house before noon, and it's uncertain whether he'll come back today. I have to talk to Keith properly. Sarah's illness is serious, and Keith needs to understand too. But Keith hasn't been taking care of Sarah much lately. Honestly, I'm not sure if he even has affection for Sarah. So I don't know how Keith will react. I dread what's to come. I sighed quietly to myself. However, Keith didn't come home that day. The next morning passed, and still no sign of him. Sarah, let's go. Reluctantly, I took Sarah with me in the morning and headed to the hospital where she was brought in by ambulance yesterday. And then she underwent various tests, including a blood test, since the morning. The test results would come later, so Sarah and I returned home somewhat tired. When we arrived home, Keith was there, drunk.
Hey, welcome back.
Keith greeted us cheerfully while drinking beer. I felt anger rise at Keith's demeanor. It was insensitive of him to act this way when Sarah was going through a tough time. I wished he had more awareness as a father. Why didn't you come home yesterday? And what about work today? My voice naturally lowered. But Keith just kept smiling happily.
We had a blast yesterday. I just got back, and I decided to take the day off.
He said, taking another swig of beer. Glancing at Sarah, I saw her looking sad. If your dad were in this state when you found out you were sick, anyone would react like this. I clenched my fists and yelled at Keith. Enough is enough. Sarah has pediatric cancer, you know, just when things are going to get tough. Do you even have any awareness of being a father? I said, glaring fiercely at Keith. Keith looked stunned when he heard my words.
Sarah has pediatric cancer, for real.
Then he turned to Sarah and asked. Sarah nodded silently, her face pale.
You've got to be kidding. This is gonna be a huge hassle. I can't afford all those medical expenses.
Keith sighed heavily. I couldn't believe it. The moment he found out his own daughter was sick, this was his response. This was his attitude. There's no way around it. He's utterly unfit to be a father. As I stood there speechless with disbelief, Keith blurted out as if it just occurred to him.
I hate dealing with complicated stuff. Maybe it's time for me to call it quits.
Huh? What do you mean by that? What does he mean by quits? A question mark hung in my mind. Then, in the next moment, Keith made an outrageous statement.
I actually have feelings for someone else. So I'm thinking of marrying her on this occasion. Sarah is in the way, so why don't you take and raise her, Michelle? Don't you have any maternal instincts?
Huh? Sarah is sick, you know. Shouldn't you be there to support her as a father? I was even more furious at Keith's words. Sarah muttered quietly, Daddy is the worst, revealing her anger. It's unbelievable that he could say something like that to his own child. But Keith didn't even try to read the atmosphere between us.
If that's the case, let's get a divorce. I happen to have the divorce papers right here.
Saying so, Keith took out crumpled divorce papers from his bag. He must have been considering remarriage with another woman for a while. Otherwise, there's no reason he would have prepared divorce papers. Keith said gleefully, Of course, you'll have custody of Sarah. I can't deal with a sick kid, and laughed. He's truly failed as a father. Sarah looked anxious at Keith's words.
Mom?
Turning pale, she clung to me. Seeing Sarah like that, I thought to myself, I can't leave Sarah with such a despicable person like Keith anymore. And even if Sarah wasn't my biological child, I still loved her dearly. So I made up my mind. I'll raise her on my own. I conveyed my determination to Keith. But Keith just laughed it off.
Be my guest. Do whatever you want.
Sarah isn't a possession. Yet Keith, treating her so lightly, only fueled my disgust. Talking to Keith any further would just be a waste of time.
Well then, I have to go to my beloved Barbara. You two better get along. Even if you both collapse, I'm already out of the picture. Don't rely on me.
Saying so, Keith abandoned Sarah and left the house. I'm so frustrated. A single tear streamed down my face. Keith had absolutely no sense of responsibility as a father until the end. With a father like that, Sarah won't catch a break. I fixed my gaze on Sarah. Sarah, looking at me, smiled sadly.
I'll be okay. Mom, don't worry about me. I'm sorry for causing so much trouble.
she murmured hesitantly. You are not trouble. It's absurd to make a 6-year-old say such things. Keith truly was the worst kind of person. My chest tightened painfully. So I hugged Sarah and quietly said, It's okay. Your dad will definitely regret this. I can't forgive him for abandoning such a cute kid. Sarah was trembling slightly.
Mom? Thank you.
Tears overflowed from her eyes. Sometime later, Sarah and I were living happily together. Fortunately, she didn't need to be hospitalized and managed her treatment with regular visits to the doctor. I can't forgive Keith, but spending time with Sarah is healing. We made sweets together and cherished our time alone. During one of those moments,
Is Sarah here?
Keith rushed back in with his face turned pale. He probably found out Sarah's secret. What nerve you have coming back now? I glared at Keith.
Shut up. It's cowardly to stay silent. Sarah, let's live together as a real family with your dad. Weren't you bullied by your stepmom?
Keith looked at Sarah, calling out to her repeatedly. Although he looked concerned, it was probably just an act. After all the terrible things he said and did, I couldn't believe he'd have a change of heart now. In the next moment, Sarah looked down at Keith with disdain and said,
Who are you?
Huh, Sarah, what are you saying? I'm your only dad, right? Did Michelle say something to you?
Keith's expression showed disbelief. Sarah retorted,
My family is just Mom. There's no Dad.
Saying so, she glared at Keith. Keith, thoroughly rejected by Sarah, looked at me in panic.
Michelle, you haven't filed for divorce yet, have you? We're still married, and Sarah is my child. Isn't that right?
Keith's eyes held a glimmer of hope. I confronted Keith with reality. I filed for divorce a long time ago. Besides, why are you bringing this up now? It had been days since Keith left home. Then Keith looked desperate.
You're too quick with things.
He muttered, stunned. But in the next moment, Keith turned to me and said,
I found out about Sarah's insurance.
It's a little late for that realization. I muttered under my breath. Sarah's secret. It's about the substantial insurance she has. The truth is, my job is in life insurance sales. That's why I understand the importance of life insurance better than anyone else. I have substantial insurance coverage for myself, including coverage for major diseases, disabilities, and long-term care, as well as pension and lump sum insurance. And it applies to Sarah too. Right after marrying Keith and becoming a family with Sarah, I enrolled her in several insurance policies. Keith was only told to get insurance for Sarah.
You'll cover the premiums, right? Then feel free to choose whatever you want.
That's what Keith said. He didn't seem interested in insurance, and he never asked about it afterward. Maybe he'd just forgotten all about it until now. But I used all my knowledge to ensure Sarah was covered by the best insurance. So why is he suddenly so interested and eager now? I found it strange. So I thought I had to ask. Why are you suddenly interested in Sarah's insurance? You didn't seem interested at all when we talked about it. I thought you'd forgotten." Then Keith said something surprising.
I was curious if there were any letters for me. I went to the house during the day and ended up taking them all. Then I accidentally brought your letter too.
Apparently, Keith came to the house and stole letters from the mailbox without permission.
And it happened to be a letter from the life insurance company. So I was curious and opened it. Turns out, it was about confirming Sarah's insurance coverage. You really had quite a lot of insurance on her.
Keith said with a smirk. I couldn't believe Keith would open a letter addressed to me without permission. I was too astonished to respond. Then, with a smirk on his face, Keith asked,
"How much insurance payout did you get for Sarah getting cancer? You had medical insurance too, right? It should have been in the letter."
Keith was breathing heavily. To be so greedy for money was disappointing. And despite Sarah being ill, he hadn't shown any concern since earlier. I didn't feel obligated to be kind to someone like that. So I decided to bluff Keith. "Who knows? Why are you asking about it now? We're already divorced, Keith. You won't get a single cent of insurance payout," I said, and Keith looked frustrated.
"It's because you've been keeping quiet."
Why did he even think he'd get insurance payout in the first place? I decided to confront him with reality. First of all, Sarah's insurance policy holder is me. I'm the one paying her insurance premiums. What right do you think you have when you've done nothing? Then Keith looked embarrassed and said,
"I'll marry you again. If I become your husband again, the money from insurance payout will be considered marital property, right?"
Keith seemed to have finally realized that the situation was not in his favor. It's only natural, I think. After all, Keith hasn't paid a single penny in insurance premiums for Sarah's insurance. Even Keith, who's usually pretty self-centered, probably realized he couldn't claim any rights. I said firmly, "Huck, no way. You're planning to marry Barbara, aren't you? I have absolutely no intention of remarrying. Who would remarry someone like this?" I outright rejected him. Then Keith turned to me for help.
"I can't remarry anymore. My marriage to Barbara is off."
Keith said that and slumped his shoulders in disappointment. "Huh? What do you mean? You left the house so confidently." I couldn't help but ask Keith. Even Sarah looked surprised. Surely Keith said he was going to remarry Barbara and left the house. So what's the deal with the sudden cancellation of the marriage? Sarah also looked puzzled. Then Keith started to speak, looking embarrassed.
"The thing is, I moved in with Barbara, but we were just goofing off together, and then I got fired. Barbara dumped me."
I see. I was truly astonished by Keith.
"Actually, it seems Barbara wanted a stay-at-home wife. She said, 'I don't need a man without money,' and kicked me out of the house."
Keith said, scratching his cheek, looking embarrassed. Even in that situation, I had no intention of giving Keith another chance. Just because you got dumped by your mistress, you think you can come back? Anyway, I'm not remarrying you, Keith. And of course, you have no rights to Sarah's insurance either.
Don't say that. Please. Just as I said.
Keith pleaded desperately with me. But I didn't change my attitude. I'm going to live with Sarah from now on. Why don't you start a new life? I replied coldly. Then Keith let out a dissatisfied voice.
Even though I was going to get Sarah's insurance payout and go back to Barbara. If I had money, maybe I could reconcile with her, right? Come on, just give me the money already.
So that's what Keith really wants. I couldn't help but be disgusted by Keith's true intentions. Just because he's Sarah's biological father, he's aiming for insurance money he hasn't paid. I couldn't help but feel truly disgusted. My anger surged even more. All you has been talking about is money. What were you planning to do if you took in Sarah? Were you really planning to take care of her properly, especially if she needed to be hospitalized? If he had been willing to take care of Sarah full-time at the hospital, then maybe there would have been some redemption as a father. I wait patiently for Keith's response. But Keith was as sleazy as ever.
I'm not gonna bother with all that. Once the insurance payout comes in, I'll just hand her over to a facility. If it's attached to a hospital, they might take her in, right?
He says it like it's the most natural thing in the world. Despicable. I can't believe what I'm hearing. Keith seems to lack any sense of responsibility as a father. He doesn't seem to care about Sarah. It's like he only sees dollar signs. So it's all about the money after all, huh? And you call yourself a father? Truly disgusting. Plus the insurance beneficiary is already set. Even if Keith were to gain custody, it wouldn't mean a thing.
What do you mean?
I explained with a sigh. Keith seemed to think that with custody, he could get the insurance payout. However, the beneficiary is typically designated at the time of the contract. So Keith has absolutely no right to claim the insurance money. Keith is at a loss.
Like, I've lost my job and my woman. I have nowhere to go. What am I supposed to do now?
Keith looks utterly hopeless. I don't know about that. Why don't you try finding a job somewhere I don't know about? It's all because of Keith's screw-ups. If he had been serious about his job, he wouldn't have gotten fired. It's truly his own fault. But it seems Keith has no intention of working for himself. In his desperation, Keith suddenly comes up with an idea, and his face lights up. Then, looking at me, he says,
I got it. I'll work as a home security guard. It's dangerous for women to live alone, right? And you'd feel safer living with someone you know a bit, wouldn't you?
Keith says, his eyes full of hope. Thinking I'm agreeing with him as I remain silent, he continues.
As my security fee, could you also chip in with some of the insurance payout?
He says, winking. Considering his current situation, it's somewhat impressive that he could come up with such an idea. Looking at Sarah, I see her staring at Keith in shock. Only Keith could make his own daughter look like that. It seems he won't understand unless I make it clear to him. I smile knowingly. Keith, seemingly influenced by my reaction, breaks into a grin. Then, in the next moment, I shout loudly, "Absolutely not. Sarah and I will be just fine on our own. I have no intention of starting over with someone like you. Don't ever show your face in front of me again."
What?
Keith looks shocked. So it was Keith who said that, right? Even if we go down together, I'm already done with you. Don't ever rely on me. I'll just throw that right back at you. Those words from that time are unforgettable to me. Keith seemed to give up on convincing me with my declaration. And now he's turning to Sarah, speaking in a sweet voice.
"Sarah, you want to live with your real dad, right? You don't want this fake mom, right?"
Keith. Here comes Keith, trying to cling to Sarah. He probably thinks if he can convince Sarah, I'll come around. Keith is so reliant on others. It's truly exasperating. I glance at Sarah, and she's angrier than I've ever seen her before. She's been tossed around by selfish Keith all this time. That anger is there within Sarah. Taking a deep breath, Sarah shouts,
"You're not my dad. I hate you. I only have Mom. Don't ever show up again."
Saying that, Sarah clings to me. Sarah. I'm moved by Sarah's words. And Keith looks frustrated.
"Oh, fine. I don't care if you regret this."
Keith says, trying to leave. But I stop him. Keith. Then Keith turns around.
"What now? Are you saying you want to start over with me after all?"
Keith seems to think I'll agree with him. He looks so confident. But I'm about to knock Keith into the abyss. I smile and tell Keith, "We may have divorced, but I'll still claim damages for your infidelity. And of course, from Barbara too. You'll regret neglecting Sarah. I'll make sure of it." Keith's face turns pale.
"I don't have any money. I don't even have a place to live. And I've quit my job."
Keith mutters. Seeing Keith's face like that, I smirk. "Too bad, huh? You thought you'd get a huge insurance payout, but instead you'll end up paying out. You're really pathetic."
"Don't mess with me."
Keith shouts in frustration. It's like the howl of a defeated dog. "If you ever show up in front of us again, I'll report you to the police. So be prepared for that." I smile at Keith and say it. Keith seemed startled by my smile and just muttered, "Okay," before hastily running away. After that, Keith went missing. Since then, I've hired a lawyer to claim damages from Keith and Barbara. At first, Barbara hesitated to pay the damages. But after being persuaded by the lawyer, she eventually agreed to pay the standard compensation. "If you're not satisfied, we can take this to court. It might get out at your workplace, though." I conveyed through the lawyer, which I think had a significant impact. I heard that Barbara ended things with Keith and is now single. She thought she could rely on a man to support her, so she took Keith away from me. But in the end, she broke up with Keith, leaving only the payment of damages. Surely, Barbara regrets how things turned out for her as well. And Keith ended up in a more dire situation than Barbara. He lost his place to live and his job. Consequently, his income dried up. He must have been mentally cornered. He started showing up in front of me and Sarah frequently. He looked disheveled and smelled a bit off. He might do something if this continues. It's not good for Sarah's emotional state either. So I consulted the police and got a restraining order against him. When Keith was lying in wait for us, the police happened to pass by and gave him a stern warning.
Sorry about that.
Keith fled from the scene. I haven't seen Keith since then. He's probably living in fear of the police by now. By the way, the damages are being covered by Keith's parents, who have apologized to us multiple times. They must feel especially sorry since I, someone unrelated to Sarah by blood, am raising her. I also received child support from them. And in exchange for paying these sums, Keith's parents seem intent on cutting ties with him. Especially my father-in-law is extremely furious.
I'll never let Keith cross our threshold again. Even if there's an inheritance, I'll never give it to Keith,
he declared. My mother-in-law condemned Keith tearfully.
It's truly pathetic. Keith is no longer my son,
she said, firmly refusing to budge. With that attitude, Keith probably can't rely on his parents' home. By the way, I've informed our middle school classmates about Keith's situation. It's to completely cut off any support Keith might have. Keith particularly cherished his friendships. Even when we were dating, he often said, I really treasure my friends from middle school. It's a lifelong bond, and stayed in touch with them. So, being cut off by his friends would be more painful than anything else. Since most of our classmates are sensible people, they probably won't lend Keith a hand. I think it serves him right. Now Keith has no one to rely on. No one to rely on for work either. Surely Keith's future isn't looking bright. Since then, I've been regularly visiting the hospital for Sarah's treatment. Fortunately, Sarah's pediatric cancer was caught early, and there's a high chance of a full recovery.
Mom, I'm sorry.
Sarah always seems apologetic, but I don't mind because I love Sarah. So I always respond, it's okay, let's hang in there together and get better soon. Treatment has just begun. There will be many challenges ahead. But as long as I'm with Sarah, we can overcome anything. Someday I'll become a real mother to Sarah. I'll keep doing my best today as well.